Becky Roberts will be your presenter today and will be joined by Lynn Markham. Becky and Lynn are both land use specialists. Becky, you may begin the webinar.
All right, thanks, Morgan, and thank you for everyone for joining today. I'm assuming most of you are Plan Commission members, but I also know we have participants from around the state who serve a variety of roles. So to help us get started today, I'm going to just provide a quick overview of the agenda, and then I'm going to have you test out that chat function. So what we'll be doing today is talking about the role of the Plan Commission. In part, the role of the Plan Commission is dependent upon the various land use tools and decisions that are assigned to them by the local governing body. So we're going to review 3 of those major tools, and I will also be focusing on terminology as well as where to go to find additional resources. So to kick off a little bit of participation, if you could find that chat box, you remember it looks a bit like this, and type in the chat box just an introduction. Who are you? Where are you coming from? It's not essential that everyone does this, but this gives us a great sense of who's joining us. I'll let you continue to be doing that in the background, and Lynn will give us a bit of a summary in just a bit after I go through a bit of initial terminology. All right, so when we talk about the Plan Commission, we can actually use a number of different terms depending upon the unit of local government and how they chose to appoint their Plan Commission. For the majority of communities in Wisconsin at the city and village level, as well as towns with village powers, they're actually doing this through Chapter 62. There's a reference in town statutes, there's a reference in village statutes, and then it directs everyone to the requirements provided by Chapter 62.23. And so under this form of appointing the Plan Commission, Plan Commissioners are appointed for 3-year terms beginning in April. Typically, there are 7 members who serve on a municipal Plan Commission. However, there actually are some options to alter the composition of the Plan Commission. So some of those options and required appointments are actually outlined in state statutes, which I'd encourage you to take a look at. And there are some communities that have used a local Plan Commission ordinance to further alter who is required to serve on their Plan Commission. So for a 7-member Plan Commission, we need to have at least 3 citizen members. And that's not necessarily about legal citizenship or even residency. It's really what we're looking for here is simply Plan Commission members who are not otherwise city officials. So that means they're not hired to serve a formal role in the community and they're not elected. So basically an appointed member, a lay person from your community. Towns with population less than 2,500, they have 5-member Plan Commissions, typically with at least 1 citizen member. I certainly encourage you to go above and beyond inviting additional people to serve on the Plan Commission. And a second option for towns that have not adopted village powers is to operate under Chapter 60.614. Under this statute, 5 members serve on the town zoning committee and they're appointed by the town board. Terms are not specified. So I find many towns will oftentimes use a local Plan Commission ordinance to provide some additional rules and requirements about who is appointed, when, how long they serve, and so forth. Okay, and then lastly, at the county level, there's actually 3 different options to appoint what's known as the county zoning agency. So the first option is to appoint a standing committee of the county board. So essentially a subset of your elected county board members. The second option would be to appoint a Plan Commission, which can be composed wholly or partly of non-county board members, so those lay people. And then lastly, you could designate an existing body. And we have examples of all 3 of these options across the state. Okay, so depending on if you're elected or not, influences how long your term is. So elected officials have 2-year terms coinciding with office, and appointed officials have 3-year staggered terms. The full size of the Plan Commission or zoning committee, depending, and people get quite creative at the county level in terms of what they call this body. The actual size or the number of members is not specified. All right, so one last important distinction here. When I use the term Plan Commission or zoning committee or some variation of that you may utilize in your local community, this is a body that's responsible for advising the governing body on broad planning and zoning matters, as well as making other decisions assigned to it that we'll talk about today. I want to make sure that you're aware that this is a distinct body from the Zoning Board of Adjustment or Zoning Board of Appeals. If your community has locally administered zoning, you're required to appoint this quasi judicial independent body that's responsible for hearing zoning variances and administrative appeals. So Lynn, next week we'll be doing an introduction to the zoning board as part of our webinar series. And if you have members of your zoning board, I would encourage them to attend that. All right, so I'm going to pause here. And Lynn, if you want to give me a quick summary, are we having mostly Plan Commission members joining us, or are we having elected officials, staff? What are we looking at in terms of the introductions?
Sure. Thanks to everyone for jumping into the chat. We have quite a variety. I would say the majority are Plan Commission members, a lot of Town Plan Commission members, as well as City and Village, and some County Zoning Committee members. We also have a number of town clerks, city administrators, as well as county administrators, and a number of Board of Appeals members and a DNR person. So quite a mix.
Wonderful. Great. And so we will state this a few times, but we will be recording this webinar. So once you receive that recording, it takes about a week to process. I do encourage you to share it with other folks within your community. So holding all of those roles, it can be quite helpful to everyone, for everyone to start with a baseline knowledge of what the Plan Commission is and what their roles are. So, all right. I also want to point out 2 resources before we get too far in depth into some of the content. One is our Plan Commission handbook. This can be found on the Center for Land Use Education website. The entire handbook is freely available to view, to download, to print, or you can also order hard copies. You can purchase those through the Center for Land Use Education, should you be interested. We also have a companion zoning board handbook. And then lastly, the materials from both of those handbooks have been put into an online set of modules. This happens to be hosted through our partner site through UW Extension. So the website is provided here. This is also accessible through the CLUE website. All right, so let's now jump into a few tools, and I will remind you, we actually have upcoming webinars on each of these 3 distinct tools. So if you feel maybe you need a little bit more information on the subdivision ordinance, but you're an old pro at zoning, I would encourage you just to join those upcoming webinars where you feel you want some additional content. So just as a high-level overview, the comprehensive plan describes the future vision of a community and how to achieve that vision. It's a planning document. It's not a regulatory document. So it's setting the vision and it's setting priorities for the community, and it's describing how to get there. Secondly, the zoning ordinance regulates land uses, densities, and dimensions of lots and structures, amongst other things. So we'll get into much more detail on that. And lastly, the subdivision ordinance is really a tool for providing a legal description when land is divided. And it's also about how we regulate the division of land, street and lot layouts, and public improvements. All right, so let's jump into the comprehensive plan to get started. I want to start with this quote. This is a quote I found many years ago, but I've continued to use it because I think it really nicely captures what planning is all about. So let me read it to you here. When we plan, we're deciding how we want our community to look, function, and feel. We create a comprehensive plan, but this is not just the title of a document, it's the description of a process too. And that second part is what's really important to me here. Okay, yes, we spend a lot of time creating plans, but the most important part is about involving your community, involving your local officials, both elected and appointed, as well as community members in the process of talking about your community, talking about your vision, and talking about how you're going to get there. So that process part is really important. And the process is actually embedded into state statutes as well. So let's take a look at what state statutes have to say about the comprehensive plan. So a plan, whether we call it a master plan or a comprehensive plan or something else, is really a statement of a community's long-term vision. It's a guide to the physical, social, and economic development of the community. It should include goals, objectives, policies, data, and maps, as well as programs and actions to implement the plan. There's actually an entire element or chapter or topic focused on implementation. So I mentioned those different elements. There's actually 9 different required elements. You can think of these as, like I said, chapters or topics. ranging from issues and opportunities. That's typically where communities are considering demographics, and they're considering planning trends and where they've been and where they're going. They may be providing projections and so forth. And then there's a lot of topic-based elements, everything from housing to transportation to agriculture, natural resources, economic development, intergovernmental cooperation, and land use. Okay, and then lastly, we typically wrap up by talking about implementation. So the plan is really just a plan. It's laying out that vision, laying out those tools that you want to utilize, but then it's thinking about what additional steps do we take now that we've created this plan. So in addition to laying out a structure for the content of a plan, the planning law also provides structure for the process. Okay, so listed here with these bullets, this is what state statutes require. I dwelled a little bit on the process of creating the plan and involving your community. And that's actually a formal requirement of planning, that we adopt written public participation procedures. We also need to, and I do want to point out all of these bullets, whether you're making a tiny incremental change to your plan, perhaps related to a rezoning request, or whether you're doing, maybe you're updating one chapter or element of your plan, or doing a wholesale update to your plan, all of these procedures actually need to be followed. So at a minimum, in terms of public participation, we need a class 1 notice at least 30 days prior to a public hearing. There's a formal role for the Plan Commission to recommend the plan by ordinance, and then the governing body adopts the plan by ordinance. Okay, there's a number of different places we need to file copies of the plan. I also recommend making it electronically available. And then at a minimum, we should be updating our comprehensive plans at least once every 10 years. Okay, so in terms of the role of the Plan Commission, there's this minimal role of recommending the plan by resolution, but honestly, the Plan Commission should be involved throughout the process of creating the plan. Thinking about what kind of capacity we have. Do we need to work with a consultant? Do we have staff? Is this something that the Plan Commission can take on and create in-house within that community? They should be looking at the data, looking at trends, identifying issues, setting a vision, setting goals, objectives. And then even after adoption of the plan, long-term monitoring of the plan. And then embedded throughout all of this is how do we engage with the public? And that's a fantastic role for the Plan Commission to hold. Okay. Also part of the comprehensive planning law is this consistency requirement. And this has changed and tightened up just a little bit over time. So the way it's currently worded is that new or amended zoning, land division, and official mapping ordinances must be consistent with an adopted comprehensive plan. That doesn't mean they need to look exactly alike. Your zoning districts don't need to necessarily look exactly like your future land use map categories in a plan. But generally, they should be supportive of each other. They shouldn't be heading in wildly different directions. And so there's been a pretty brief definition for consistent provided now, which means furthers or does not contradict the objectives, goals, and policies of the plan. So I like to think of this visually. The comprehensive plan we have here at the top of the screen, I think of this as this big umbrella document, setting the vision, and then we can have a variety of tools to implement the plan. Here on this image, I've just shown these 3 regulatory tools that need to be consistent with the plan, but also keep in mind that there's a whole variety of non-regulatory tools. And to have effective plan implementation, you probably need a range of tools. So I'll leave this slide up here for a few moments. Lynn and I teach a plan implementation tools course, and this is a slide I've used to kind of illustrate the breadth of tools that are out there. So if we think about at the top, we can have a whole range of regulatory tools. As we kind of move around this wheel, so to speak, we can have a variety of coordination or intergovernmental tools. We can have a variety of financial tools and investment decisions. And we can also have voluntary and performance and incentive-based tools. We can have planning tools where we're gathering additional information and making recommendations, and we can have design-based tools. So I would encourage you, even though we're focusing on these 3 major tools that plan commissioners are using, think about, especially in the planning context, how do we move beyond these tools to have a more holistic view of our community, and how can we utilize additional tools at our disposal? Okay, so I do want you to pull out those that chat box function again. These first two questions are really just for you to reflect on internally, but I want you to think about, do you have a copy of your comprehensive plan? Maybe you have a printed copy in a binder, maybe you know how to find it online. Take a peek at when it was last created and think about, is this out of date? Is it more than 10 years old? And should we be thinking about some updates? Sometimes it takes a good year or 2 or 3 years to really get the process started, to set aside funding, to set aside time to accomplish some of these things. All right, so the second part of these questions, I want you to pick one of these questions, and I want you to share your answers in the chat box. So think about, how are you using your plan? What updates potentially are needed if you're at that stage? Or otherwise, what are some of the major planning issues in your community? So I think we're going to get a variety of answers, and Lynn's going to be reviewing these and sharing in just a moment. As you're doing that, yes.
We do have one question that came in before you got to those chat answers. And that is, what would you recommend if we're under county zoning? Do we follow those rules in our comp plan?
Yeah, so towns that partner with counties on zoning oftentimes also have very good relationships where they're partnering with the county on a county-wide, oftentimes multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plan. And that is a valid option. I can provide you some examples of that. But the other thing is, sometimes there's things that the county is going to be paying attention to in a countywide comprehensive plan. As a town, you may want to take a step back and say, is this satisfying our needs? Or do we want to do some additional add-ons? Or perhaps in some counties, there's not necessarily an opportunity to participate in that countywide plan. And so then, yes, I do recommend, even if you're under county zoning, that you consider having a town comprehensive plan. When we get into the zoning webinar, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the process for towns to provide input to the county, both on conditional uses as well as rezones. And towns have the opportunity to essentially block a county rezone that impacts their town. And so from a legal standpoint, I recommend having that comprehensive plan as a basis for making your recommendations. So yeah, I encourage planning at the town level. Certainly do so in cooperation with the county if available. So let me refocus then on this map. There's two maps here. On the left, we have countywide or statewide status of comprehensive plans at the county level. And you can see those that are shown in this lighter blue area are, and this is 2 years old, so there's constantly updates here. But those shown in blue have plans that were updated within the last 10 years. This was created in 2023. Those shown in this darker gray shade at that point in time had plans that had passed the 10-year mark. And then there are a variety of towns shown in the lightest gray here where no comprehensive plan has been adopted. And I know there have been some updates here. Vernon County is one that recently adopted a plan, and now they're working on zoning and subdivision. And then to contrast that with the map on the right, this, you can mostly see town status. These smaller squares are, again, using the same coloration, blue, or have plans created within the last 10 years. Dark gray have plans that are more than 10 years old. And then there's a number of areas where no plans have been adopted. And if you visit the online version of this, you can zoom in and you can see municipal status. Okay? The other thing you can do is, if you've had a plan more recently adopted, one of the requirements of the law is that you submit a copy of that plan to the Wisconsin Department of Administration. So that eventually will assist with some updates to this map. All right, so now you've had lots of time to reflect in the chat box. And Lynn, what kind of answers are you seeing here? Anything listed more than once?
We're getting a range. We have some communities who did a comp plan a long time ago because they had to, and they haven't used it much. We have some communities that are using their plan and recognizing that it's time to update it, or at least update parts of it. We have some communities that are that are planning to update their plan. They're identifying what issues they want to include in their next comp plan, which topics. And some communities have applied for grant funding or applied for funding in order to do the revisions. And some communities have recent revisions within the last couple of years.
Great. And any feedback on topics? I'm curious.
Not specific topics
Okay.
listed.
Yeah. And I will say, when I travel around the state doing in-person workshops, or when people request kind of specific workshops, housing tends to be the big issue that I'm hearing statewide. But that does tend to be in larger areas that are growing and have a bit more population pressure. So I think one of the questions I really enjoy asking when we are doing these in-person workshops is, what is the main priority? What, if you could pick one element to spend your time on, where would you spend it? And you do get a wide range of responses from a town versus a city, from a rural area versus an urban area. But think internally, where do you want to be spending your time on plan updates? I don't recommend that you spend the same amount of time on every single element. If housing is your issue, then maybe focus on updating that element first. If economic development is your gig, or if natural resources is really important to your town, that's where you should be spending more of your effort. All right, so I just want to point you to some comprehensive planning resources. Probably one of the better places where some of these resources have been compiled is on the DOA website. There is a library of comprehensive plans that have been recently adopted. I like to use that as inspiration, so you can see what other communities are doing. Sometimes that can spur you to think about what you could do in your community. And then there's a variety of other resources listed on this website as well. All right, with that, let's transition to zoning. And actually, I think we're gonna be a little behind time on here, so I'm gonna share why do we have zoning. Okay, so zoning is just one tool of many to achieve community goals. When I ask this in in-person workshops, the first response I get from most people is to avoid incompatible uses. So let's not have residential in the same area where we have industrial development, for example. That's what most people think of, and that's for use-based zoning. That is one very important function. But there's a variety of other things. We can preserve or protect all sorts of different types of natural resources. So if you are a farming community, or if you are a community that has a lot of water resources or woodlots, those are all things that can potentially be protected through zoning. We can do a bit with community character and aesthetics. It's also about finding this balance between protecting public and private investments and property rights. And then probably the most important one, if we were to go back 100 years ago to when we first created zoning in this country, and you're going to find a purpose statement. And the reason why this was legally upheld was that one of the legitimate purposes of zoning was to protect public health, safety, and welfare. So similar to that status map for comprehensive plans, we can also look at who has zoning. So what you're going to see here in green, so probably the largest area of the state spatially would be towns that are under county zoning. So they directly partner with the county for the county to administer zoning within these unincorporated areas. About 60% of towns partner with counties on zoning. Okay, and then in blue, so definitely all the way from here from Northeast Wisconsin, and then this band down to Southeast Wisconsin, those are areas where municipal zoning is much more popular. So about 20% of towns have adopted their own town zoning ordinance. The vast majority of cities have it as well. And then about 75% of villages have a local town, city, or village adopted ordinance. And then lastly, another legit option, kind of shown in this white or light gray, there are a number of communities throughout the state that do not have zoning. So that last map showed general zoning. We can also have specialized forms of zoning, things like shoreland, wetland, floodplain zoning, wellhead protection districts, airport protection zones, extraterritorial zoning. Some of these forms of zoning oftentimes act like an overlay. So you may have base zoning districts like residential, commercial, etc. And then you have additional requirements that apply within a certain distance of a given resource, such as a wellhead area or a lake or a river, etc. So primarily what we're going to cover today is general zoning, not these specialized forms of zoning. All right, so when we think about zoning, there's really two different major components. So on the left here, for those visual people, this is where I always go first when I'm trying to understand the zoning ordinance, is I go to the map. So the map divides the community into different zoning districts. So residential, commercial, industrial, here's your airport overlay, maybe some different set aside areas for conservancy or shoreline wetland areas, etc. Then the text is where you go to figure out what rules apply within those districts and what rules apply community-wide. So I just want to walk you a little bit through the structure of a zoning ordinance. So typically we start with purpose statements, we move on to zoning districts, uses, dimensional and development standards, and administrative procedures. Let's take a quick peek at each of those things. All right, in terms of zoning districts, the one thing I often get questions on and need to point out when we get to this slide is that there's no uniform set of zoning districts throughout this state. Okay, what you see here on the screen is probably a much more urban example of zoning districts. And you can see there's some similarities probably to what you have in your community. In this particular community, they have 6 different residential zoning districts, each associated with different levels of intensity or density. They have a variety of commercial districts, industrial districts. They have some mixed use districts and some other specialized districts. If we were to look in a rural community, you might see something very different in terms of districts. Maybe you have a rural residential district or an agriculture and woodland transition district, farmland preservation, etc. Okay, so you have the ability to craft local districts as you see fit. Then within any given zoning district, we also typically list uses that are allowed, which are called permitted uses. These are allowed by right in all parts of the zoning district. Your zoning administrator is the one responsible for granting permitted uses. Right? Then we have the second category, conditional uses. These should also be listed for a given district, and they are allowed if they meet the ordinance standards as well as any conditions that the local governing body imposes that relate to the ordinance purpose. Okay, this can be assigned to one of 3 bodies. So this may be one of your roles as a plan commission. This can be assigned to the zoning board, the plan commission, or the governing body. Your local ordinance should describe who gets this authority. If not, it now reverts to the zoning board of adjustment or zoning board of appeals. I also oftentimes get the question for townsend or county zoning. They'll say, can we as a plan commission provide recommendations on this? Even though maybe it's the county board or the county board of adjustment that decides conditional uses. Yes, that's a very common practice. Okay, then lastly here, shown in red, are prohibited uses. So anything that's not expressly listed or not expressly prohibited as described in the text is not allowed. So if we wanted to illustrate this visually, let's just say we have a given residential district, some different permitted uses, might be single family homes, maybe a townhome, maybe some sort of multi-unit residential property here. Examples of conditional uses that are typical within a residential district. Here we have a bed and breakfast, maybe some small family sized daycare, or maybe there's a particular residential district that butts up with a commercial area, and there's been some allowed conversion of residential uses to small scale commercial. It's really up to the community to decide what will be allowed. And then lastly, what might you see for prohibited uses? Full-on commercial, industrial, self-storage, those types of things are generally not thought of as compatible with residential districts. So in the case of conditional uses, these are things where you can actually add standards to your local ordinance, and you can potentially also attach conditions at the time of granting these things related to operational issues or dimensional issues, such as parking, signage, hours of operation, etc. So a lot of communities, when we think about the text of an ordinance, they can be very prescriptive, and they can try and list every single use allowed under the sun or not allowed. One trend I've been seeing is that communities are going to more of a category type system where they're listing categories and they're providing sample uses, and they're saying these are the use types that are generally allowed within these districts, and then they typically only call out certain uses if they require an additional level of review or regulation. The other trend I've been seeing is that more and more communities are using use tables. So the way this works, this is just kind of our cartoon version of it. But down the left side, we have some sample uses, and across we have some sample districts. So let's say I lived in this community and I was interested in having backyard chickens. I could say, all right, residential poultry, where is that allowed? So you can see shown in green and with P for a permitted use. This is allowed in each of these communities, agricultural districts, as well as their rural residential district. And then it's shown in yellow or as a conditional use for the single and multifamily residential district, and then it's not allowed in the commercial district. All right, and so we may also have dimensional standards. Again, you can list these in the text, but I find it's becoming much more easy, and a growing number of communities are utilizing graphics to illustrate things like lot dimensions, minimum or maximum lot sizes, density, setbacks. So we may have setbacks from a street, from side yards, or from a rear yard, or potentially also from a resource, like a setback from a lake or a river. Okay. We can think about lot coverage, so how much open or green space compared to how much developed space or impervious surface, and we can also limit height. In addition, many communities will include development standards. These are just some examples here. So parks and open space, stormwater management, tree protection, etc. Sometimes this is found directly in a zoning ordinance, and sometimes some of these things are handled in a standalone ordinance, but relate to the zoning ordinance based on districts or categories of uses. Signage is a really great example of that. And then lastly, we have the administrative procedure section. This tells us who does what are your review standards, what's your timeline. Okay, so again, it can be really helpful either within the zoning ordinance or in companion materials to kind of lay out graphically what your process looks like. So if a local community member is interested in rezoning their property, or they're interested in getting a simple land use permit, who do they go talk to? What's that timeline? Who reviews, etc. So again, just thinking here at a very high level, if you had to walk away, if you're completely new to the Plan Commission and you want to walk away with some terminology related to zoning, these are the types of these are the types of decisions that I recommend you become familiar with. Okay, so permitted uses and conditional uses, which we discussed. Figure out, are you as a Plan Commission member assigned to review conditional uses? If not, you may still have some role in thinking about how the ordinance is written to allow for conditional uses. Then a rezone or a zoning amendment is essentially a change to the zoning ordinance, either the map or the text. As a Plan Commission member, you do have a role in rezones and changing the ordinance. Your role is actually making recommendations to the governing body who's responsible for approving these changes. Okay, and then lastly, the last two decisions, these are made by your zoning board of adjustment or zoning board of appeals. So a variance is essentially a relaxation of an ordinance standard, and this may be allowed by the zoning board provided state standards are met. And then lastly, any of your decisions, whether it's a staff decision of the Plan Commission, etc., can be appealed. And so administrative appeals or interpretations of zoning ordinances oftentimes will go to the zoning board, and then there's some decisions that can go above and beyond that through the court system.
Becky,
Yes.
We have a question related to your last slide. It's really related to breaking down permitted uses. The question is, what do you recommend to differentiate between automatically allowed uses and permitted uses that require a permit?
Yeah, so I would say in smaller communities, especially where there's not dedicated zoning staff, this is where I tend to see this. Where there's some communities that say for every single change in use, we're going to require some sort of permit. And oftentimes they'll tie that into an occupancy permit as well. But then there's other communities where they just allow certain changes in uses to occur, as long as they're listed in the ordinance. So it's really up to the community to decide, do we need to associate a specific permitting process to this? Does staff or a designated person within our community need to review it or not? So typically, if there's a change to dimensions, so let's say you're changing the footprint of a structure, typically that's something where you're going to want a permit associated with that, so you can make sure they're staying within those physical dimensional boundaries. But then on the use side, it kind of, let's say you have a home and the owner changes, that's not something where you're typically going to require a permit. So you need to decide at what point does it make sense for the community to get involved and to review changes in use. All right, so then quickly reviewing, putting up 4 of the major bodies that are involved in planning and zoning. Sorry, actually, this will be zoning decisions here. So if you have the luxury of planning and zoning staff, they are typically involved in drafting, reviewing, and providing technical support. At a minimum, the plan commission or zoning committee provides a recommendation on these legislative functions where you're crafting the ordinance or making a change to it. And then the actual change itself is made by the governing body. Permitted uses are a staff function. Conditional uses can be assigned to one of these 3 bodies. And then variances and administrative appeals are assigned to that zoning board of adjustment or appeals. So just to summarize, the plan commission role is really making recommendations on ordinance changes or rezones. And potentially, they may also be assigned conditional uses. Okay. So one thing I want to point out here, and this is most important with the Plan Commission, because they're often kind of figuring out what their role is based upon the decision they're making. Sometimes they function in a legislative capacity. If you want to think about this, this is when you're exercising broad discretion to make policy. So creating plans or updating plans or ordinances. In Wisconsin, rezones tend to fall in this category. Okay, so the Plan Commission provides a recommendation to the governing body, and that's in contrast to quasi-judicial decisions. Think about this more as applying the written standards found in your ordinance. Okay, so you're evaluating a given land use proposal, and then sometimes you may also be crafting some conditions to attach to that. So a couple of examples here where the Plan Commission is involved would be a rezone as an example of a legislative decision, a conditional use as an example of quasi-judicial. The reason I point this out is because how you engage with the public and what rules you follow, what procedures you follow, are closely related to what type of decision it is. So think about these legislative decisions as creating new standards that apply to the community as a whole, or at least to a broad segment of the community. Your role may actually be going out and seeking public participation. And that can be done through a variety of means. It could be through a public hearing, it could be through workshops, it could be through listening to people through surveys around the street. Okay, there's very little concern about discussion outside of a hearing. And I want to contrast that with quasi-judicial decisions, where there is a specific public hearing typically required, and you're required to be an impartial decision maker. You're required to apply the ordinance standards as written. Okay? And so then it becomes much more important that you consider public input and fact-finding and decision-making within the confines of a public hearing. So just to illustrate how the Plan Commission can be can sometimes move between these roles. If we think about a conditional use on the legislative side, there have been some state statute changes to how we handle conditional uses. And so this resulted in a flurry of communities going back and updating or reviewing and sometimes updating their conditional use standards. Okay, so you, as a plan commission member and as a governing body member, you could be involved in this legislative role. And then at times you may also be asked to then apply the ordinance and provide a recommendation on a specific conditional use or to actually make that decision. All right, so I'm going to pause here, Lynn. Were there any other questions on zoning before we move into subdivision regulations?
There were not.
Okay, so we will have about 10 minutes reserved at the end, so that if you think of additional zoning questions or any other topic that we've covered here, we can pause and address those questions at the end. And then if you have more detailed questions on zoning and want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of some of these decisions, I would encourage you to join us for that zoning webinar. I will have them coming. All right, so then let's move into subdivision regulations. All right, so first and foremost, and some communities will call this a land division regulation or a subdivision regulation. And that's really because one of the primary purposes of a land division or a subdivision regulation is really to provide a legal process for dividing land and recording that property. Okay? In addition, especially when we're thinking about, let's say, residential subdivisions, we are also interested in reviewing for the physical layout of that development, thinking about connections with existing development, and then thinking about public safety, utilities, and other improvements that we might desire within those areas. So in Wisconsin, we have 3 different levels of review. So the state is involved in reviewing state-defined subdivision plats. Okay? The vast majority of counties have, actually all counties are involved in reviewing state-defined subdivision plats. But what this map shows is the vast majority of counties also have locally adopted ordinances. And I think this is a 15-year-old map, so there's some updates that are needed here. I think Milwaukee stays in pink as not having an ordinance because they're completely urbanized. I know Vernon County is working on one. I think Menominee and Ozark County have probably actually adopted ordinances since this map was created. And then lastly, the third level of review can happen at the local level. So again, this map shows which towns, cities, and villages have adopted ordinances. And again, heaviest development pressure typically translates to locally adopted subdivision ordinances. So quite a few in southeast Wisconsin, northeast Wisconsin, around Dane County, kind of western Wisconsin, and so forth. All right, so let's pull out this chat function again and give you all just a little bit of an opportunity to participate here. Which of these 3 subdivisions, which I'll describe, do you think is considered a subdivision under state law? Okay, so you can type in number 1, number 2, number 3, or some combination of those. So what we have here, let's say we have a 25-acre parcel, and in the first example here, we carve off 3 one-acre parcels all at one time. They're all created within 1 year. That's one option. Let's say we have that same starting parcel and we carve off, let's say those 3 acres, and then sometime within that next 5-year period, we carve off an additional 3 one-acre parcels. Okay, and then the third option is, let's say, all at once we divide 25 acres into 5 5-acre parcels. Which of these do you think falls under state subdivision review? I'm seeing lots of 3s pop up right away. Does anyone disagree with that? All right, so drum roll. The answer is the middle one. Okay, so at the state level, a subdivision is defined as the creation of 5 or more parcels of 1.5 acre or less within a 5-year period. So at the state level, that definition is really not designed to capture these large lot subdivisions. However, and I've got a slide on this in just a short bit, local regulations can actually alter the definition of a subdivision. Okay, so just to remind you, 5 or more parcels, 1.5 acre or less, either all at one time or within a period of 5 years. So when a state defined subdivision occurs, the state, and we're talking the Department of Administration, they have a plat review division. They would review for surveying, layout, mapping, and plat submittal requirements. So they're really focused on pretty high level kind of technical details. It's not so much the quality of the development necessarily or the public improvements that are being made. It's more so about, are we legally recording this correctly? And then they are looking at some high level safety issues as well. So local ordinances, should you choose to adopt them, and again, it can occur at the county, town, city, or village level, can define a subdivision differently. Okay, so you can require different levels of review. Local ordinances can also impose additional requirements. The most common one that I think people are interested in is public improvement requirements. So maybe coming with road standards or lighting or fire protection, different things of that nature. I'll provide some of those examples in just a bit. What happens, because we potentially have 3 different levels of review, is that when review authority overlaps, so let's say there's both a town and a county ordinance in a given area, the most restrictive provision from any given ordinance applies. One thing I do want to point out here is that you may not review for use or public improvements in an extraterritorial area. So if you're a city or a village, you actually have the automatic ability to review state-defined subdivision plats and potentially additional plats or CSMs within a 1.5 mile boundary. If you're a 4th class city or a village, the cutoff is usually 10,000 people, or you can review up to 3 miles if you are a 1st, 2nd, or 3rd class city. Okay? So again, you cannot review for use because that would be akin to extraterritorial zoning. So again, you could review for that if you had that. And you cannot require public improvements outside your municipal boundary. All right, so this slide is just meant to illustrate some of the different design standard or public improvement requirements that we might think of associated with subdivisions. So requirements like roads, sidewalks, parks or open space, tree planting or preservation requirements, stormwater management, sewer and water, or potentially septic systems, a whole host of fire protection requirements, whether that means providing fire hydrants or limiting cul-de-sacs and turn radiuses, things of that nature. Okay, so these are all things you can choose to address in a local subdivision ordinance. And actually, I'm just curious, just so that you're all staying engaged, if you guys want to quickly indicate either with a yes, we have a local subdivision ordinance in our community, or no, we do not. I'm just kind of curious for those who are joining us, who has what? So go ahead and pop that in there as well. As you're doing that, high level terminology again. So when we hear the word plat, all that refers to is simply a map of a subdivision. So a state defined subdivision or a locally defined subdivision. Okay, so that's a plat. And then a CSM stands for a certified survey map. There's actually an expedited process for land divisions that do not meet your state or local definition of a subdivision. Okay? And that's typically based on number or size of lots being created. So the way that process works is that you would survey, monument it, and map it by a professional land surveyor, and then it's filed with the county register of deeds. If the CSM happens to involve dedication of streets or other land, then it needs to be submitted to the governing body, and you have 90 days to act. Some communities require submission of CSMs regardless of whether public land is being dedicated. And that's oftentimes just simply to review for errors or other local issues. All right, so let's see, I'm seeing lots of yeses. Just a handful of no's or do not know. So that's your homework. is to go check out, do we have this? And is it our town or our city and village, or perhaps do we have one at the county level? So this is the example I promised. This happens to be from Oneida County, but this illustrates how a local subdivision or land division ordinance can actually define what undergoes review a little bit differently than the state. Okay, so up here at the top, 5 or more parcels of 1.5 acre or less, created all at once or within a 5-year period, is what the state reviews for. And then here in Oneida County, whenever any parcel is created that's 10 acres or more, it undergoes a basic review for utility and road access. Then it's considered a minor subdivision if we have 1 to 8 parcels of 10 acres or less, or it's considered a major subdivision, or oftentimes a county plat if 8 or more parcels of 10 acres or less are created. And sometimes I've compiled, depending on where I'm visiting for different workshops, every single standard across the state is different. Some counties are capturing 40 acres or less. Some are, concerned with 1, 2, 5, 10 acres. So they're looking at much smaller parcel sizes. It's really up to you to define number of parcels and parcel size that you want to capture. All right, so just looking at a typical plat review process, this first step is currently not required, but I recommend it. You'll see once we get to preliminary and final plat approval, it often involves quite an expense by the developer. It typically involves engineering skills, mapping skills. So I think it's best to start with a pre-application conference. This is essentially an informal review intended to spot problems up front. So if you think about it, if you have staff, or perhaps it's even the plan commission or a designated member of your town board who sits down with the landowner or the developer, you walk through what your development requirements are, and then maybe even just have a back of the envelope type drawing of here's what we want to do, how might this fit within local regulations. So you can actually require this as a required step in your local ordinance if you choose to. Once we get to preliminary and final plat approval requirements, there's certain timelines that are outlined in state statutes that you need to comply with. Okay, so preliminary plat, if a developer submits, or if you require them to submit a preliminary plat, you need to act within 90 days of receiving this. This is really important. I want to point this out. Even if you don't have a local land division or subdivision ordinance, state defined plats might still come your way. And if you ignore them, if you ignore a preliminary plat, what the rules say is that final plat is entitled to approval if it complies with local plans and ordinances, meets the objections of state agencies, and substantially conforms with an approved preliminary plat. What that means is if you ignore the preliminary plat that's submitted, you are essentially approving it. Okay, and so you lose out on some of your review authority once it gets to the final plat approval stage. So take action, reach out, talk to plat reviews so you know what your role is and how you go about reviewing those things. In terms of final plat approval, you have to act within 60 days. Typically by this stage, most of the details of the subdivision have been planned out. All right, and then lastly, in terms of who does what, the subdivision ordinance itself, as well as changes to it and plats, must be reviewed by the plan commission. And then the governing body may delegate preliminary or final plat approval to the plan commission as well. Okay. Anything that dedicates streets, highways, or other lands must have final approval by the governing body. All right, so the go-to source on subdivision plats would again be the Wisconsin Department of Administration. They have a plat review unit, and one of their key resources is the Wisconsin Platting Manual, which is updated as changes roll out to state statutes. So you can see the full manual. The most recent change was completed in June 2024. All right, so that brings us to the end of this webinar, designed to provide an overview of the key decisions and key tools that the Plan Commission is working with. So Lynn, I would invite you to review if there have been any questions submitted or for
Yes.
other folks to submit additional questions.
So we have two questions right now, Becky. The first one related to platting is how long does a subdivision plat remain legally in place if the plat is never developed?
That's a great question, and I would actually have to look that one up here. I'm wondering if there's anyone else online who happens to know that question offhand. I think that would probably be a question for plat review, and it may be specified in the platting manual. I'd be happy to, if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to see if I can look up an answer to that.
Okay. Another question that came in, and I can address this one a bit, is please elaborate on what type of ex parte communication is or is not allowed during quasi-judicial decision making, such as a conditional use. And the way that the law reads on this is you can, so first I should define ex parte communication. That's without the other party present, so outside of the meeting, outside of the hearing. So you can have logistical discussion outside, what time are we meeting, where are we meeting, all those sorts of topics can happen outside, but anything related to the actual decision or proposal in front of you should not happen outside of the hearing or meeting when it's a quasi-judicial decision, like a conditional use or a variance. If there is an on-site inspection where the Plan Commission or the zoning board goes out on site, you can get clarification on what you're looking at. Where is the setback shown? Where is the building proposed? Those sorts of things. But there shouldn't be any discussion about whether the conditional use or variance is to be approved. And then it looks like we have some new things. Okay, we have
So
that.
one of them, I think, was actually a response to you, Lynn. We have that set out in the zoning ordinance. And so I think what that's referring to is sometimes procedural issues will actually be addressed in a zoning ordinance, or you can also use local bylaws or rules of procedure, kind of like a procedural manual that can help guide members of your governing body or your appointed body with some of those procedural issues. So we do have examples of those bylaws and rules of procedure should you wish to create some. I think there's also some examples in both our Plan Commission and Zoning Board handbook as well.
Mm-hmm.
Were you
And
spotting anything else, Lynn?
No, that's all I see for questions right now. A couple of thank yous.
Awesome. I just want to remind everyone, it does take a few days to process the recording of the video. We will be posting that on the Center for Land Use Education website. Will be located under training and webinars, and then it's divided by topic. We'll also try to send out an email once those are available. So I want to thank you again for joining us. If you are joining for future webinars, come prepared to interact and come with questions that you can use to stump us. All right. Thank you again for joining. I appreciate it.
Thank you.